Countries around the world are picking up the phone and calling Canada. They're calling our energy minister. They're asking one simple question: what can you sell us? For the first time in decades, the world desperately needs Canadian energy. And we might finally be ready to deliver. Let me paint you a picture of what's happening in the world right now. It's March 2026. The United States and Israel are at war with Iran. Bombs are falling on Iranian military facilities, nuclear sites, and oil infrastructure. And Iran has responded by doing something that affects every single country on the planet. They shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you're not familiar with the Strait of Hormuz, let me explain why this is such a massive deal. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. It's only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and through this tiny choke point flows approximately 20% of the entire world's oil and liquefied natural gas. We're talking about 20 million barrels of oil every single day. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar. All the major Gulf oil producers shipped their product through this strait. When Iran closed it, they didn't just disrupt a trade route. They sent shockwaves through the entire global economy. Oil prices went absolutely insane. Before the war started, Brent crude oil was trading around $65 a barrel. Within days of the strait closure, it shot past $100. At its peak, it hit $126 a barrel. That's nearly double the pre-war price. This is being described as the largest disruption to global energy supply since the 1970s oil crisis. Some analysts say it's the largest disruption in the history of the global oil market, ever. And you're feeling it right now. At the gas pump, in your heating bills, in the price of everything that gets transported by truck or ship or plane. Energy costs ripple through the entire economy. So what do countries do when their primary oil supply gets cut off? They look for alternatives. They look for stable, reliable suppliers who can deliver energy without the risk of war, without the risk of blockades, without the risk of some dictator deciding to hold the global economy hostage. And guess which country has massive oil and gas reserves, stable democratic governance, no wars, no geopolitical choke points, and is already one of the largest energy producers in the world? Canada. Canada is the fourth largest oil producer in the world. We're the fifth largest natural gas producer, and we have some of the biggest proven oil reserves on the planet, concentrated in Alberta's oil sands. We have massive natural gas reserves in the Montney Formation in British Columbia. We have offshore petroleum resources in Newfoundland and Labrador, and unlike Middle Eastern oil that has to pass through conflict zones and narrow straits controlled by hostile powers, Canadian energy is geopolitically safe. No wars, no blockades, no Revolutionary Guards threatening to blow up tankers. As one government official put it, Canada is a safe, low-risk, low-cost, and increasingly low-carbon exporter. And now, for the first time in a long time, the world is actually calling. Canada's energy minister has been receiving calls from countries around the world asking about Canadian energy exports. His press secretary confirmed it publicly. They said, and I quote, "Yes, we can confirm that the minister has been receiving calls from countries interested in Canada's energy exports. Unfortunately, we're not able to disclose which or how many countries have reached out." Think about what that means. Government officials from countries around the world are literally picking up the phone, calling Ottawa and asking, "What can Canada sell us? How fast can you deliver? What's it going to cost?" This is unprecedented. For years, Canada has struggled to find markets for its energy beyond the United States. We've been landlocked, pipeline constrained, dependent on American refineries buying our oil at a discount. And now the world is coming to us. So what is Canada doing about it? First, let's talk about the immediate response to the crisis. The International Energy Agency, that's a coalition of 32 member countries, agreed to release 400 million barrels of oil from emergency reserves. This is the largest coordinated release of strategic petroleum reserves in history. The goal is to stabilize global markets and bring down oil prices. Canada committed to contribute 23.6 million barrels to this effort. Now here's where it gets interesting. Canada is the only G7 country that doesn't maintain a strategic petroleum reserve. We're a net exporter of oil, so under IEA rules, we don't have to keep emergency stockpiles. We produce more than we consume, so we're not vulnerable to supply disruptions in the same way that Japan or Germany or France are. So how is Canada going to contribute 23.6 million barrels if we don't have reserves? The answer is increased production. Canadian oil output is going to rise by about 140,000 barrels per day starting in April. Most of that increase is coming from already planned production expansions in Alberta's oil sands. It's not a dramatic surge. It's about a 2.6% increase from the 5.3 million barrels per day Canada produced on average in 2025. But it's something. And it shows that Canada is stepping up when the world needs it. Prime Minister Mark Carney has been pushing hard on the energy file since he took office. His message is simple. Canada has the resources the world needs, and we need to build the infrastructure to deliver them. At a press conference during the crisis, Carney was asked about Canada's energy position. He said, Canada doesn't need to maintain strategic reserves because we're providing oil to the market. In other words, we're not hoarders, we're suppliers. Our contribution to global energy security is production, not stockpiles. He's been talking up specific projects too. The Bay du Nord development off Newfoundland is a big one. It's a massive offshore oil project, about 500 kilometers east of St. John's. Carney called it a very attractive project that will produce very low carbon oil in terms of production and transportation. Norway's Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre, who visited Canada recently for NATO exercises, described Bay du Nord as a huge project and a major energy undertaking that will create thousands of jobs and generate significant revenue. The project was approved back in 2022, but it's been waiting for a final investment decision. First oil isn't expected until 2031. But with global energy markets in chaos and prices sky high, the economics for Bay du Nord are looking better than ever. But it's not just about production, it's about markets. For too long, Canada has been overly dependent on the United States as our energy customer. Something like 97% of Canadian oil exports go to the US. That's not diversification, that's dependence. And when Donald Trump is slapping tariffs on Canadian goods and threatening our entire trading relationship, that dependence becomes a vulnerability. So the Carney government has been aggressively pursuing new markets. And the Iran crisis has supercharged those efforts. Just a few weeks ago, Prime Minister Carney completed a major trip to India, Australia, and Japan. Energy was at the center of almost every conversation. In India, Carney met with Prime Minister Narendra Modi and signed a landmark deal. Saskatchewan-based Cameco, one of the world's largest uranium producers, will supply nearly 22 million pounds of uranium to India for nuclear energy generation. That's a $2.6 billion deal running from 2027 to 2035. India has enormous energy needs. It's the fastest growing major economy in the world, and Indian officials made their position crystal clear. One of them literally said, "We're willing to buy whatever Canada is offering." Think about that statement. A country of 1.4 billion people is telling Canada, "We'll take everything you can produce. Whatever you're selling, we're buying." The two countries set a goal to more than double bilateral trade to $70 billion by 2030. They're working toward a comprehensive free trade agreement by the end of this year. Energy, oil, gas, uranium, critical minerals is at the heart of it. In Japan, Carney met with Prime Minister Takaichi Sanae to discuss clean energy partnerships, critical minerals, and LNG exports. Japan is one of the world's largest importers of liquefied natural gas, and they're desperate for reliable suppliers who aren't located in geopolitically unstable regions. In Australia, Carney addressed both houses of Parliament, the first Canadian Prime Minister to do so in nearly 20 years. The focus was on defense, maritime security, and yes, energy cooperation. This is what trade diversification looks like, and the Iran crisis has made it more urgent than ever. Let's talk about LNG Canada, because this is one of the biggest success stories in Canadian energy history. Last summer, Canada shipped its first ever international cargo of liquefied natural gas from the LNG Canada facility in Kitimat, British Columbia. This was a historic moment. After years of delays, regulatory battles, and political fights, Canada finally had an LNG export terminal on the Pacific coast. The facility is currently exporting about 1 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day. As it ramps up to full capacity, that should double to about 2 billion cubic feet per day. Now, in the context of global markets, that's still relatively small. The Strait of Hormuz closure has blocked somewhere between 9 and 10 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. LNG Canada can't fill that gap on its own. But it's a start. And there are more projects coming. LNG Canada Phase 2 is in development. The Kasai Lissam's LNG project is moving forward. Cedar LNG, Woodfibre LNG, Tilbury LNG. All of these projects would add to British Columbia's export capacity. Combined, they could bring BC's total LNG production to between 6 and 7 billion cubic feet per day. The Montney Formation, that massive natural gas deposit that spans British Columbia and Alberta, has enough reserves to supply these projects for decades. Industry experts say 70% of the Montney resource is in British Columbia, and it hasn't been developed nearly as extensively as American shale plays. As one energy executive put it, in the US, over the next 10 to 15 years, you start to run out of high-quality resources. In Canada, we have well over 30 years. That's Canada's competitive advantage. We have the reserves, we have the stability, we just need the infrastructure to get it to market. Now, I want to be honest with you about the challenges, because this isn't all sunshine and roses. First, infrastructure constraints are real. Our pipelines are running at or near capacity. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers said there's very minimal room to increase production in the short term without new infrastructure. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which finally came online after years of delays and cost overruns, has given us better access to Pacific markets, but it's already running at about 90% capacity. There's not much room to add more volume. Building new pipelines takes years. Building new LNG terminals takes years. The projects that could meaningfully increase Canada's export capacity are still in development, and first production might not come until 2030 or beyond. Second, Canada doesn't have a strategic petroleum reserve. We're the only G7 country without one. That means when there's a global supply crunch, we can't just open the taps on a stockpile. We have to increase production in real time, which is harder and slower. The 23.6 million barrels Canada committed to the IEA release, that's essentially coming from already planned production increases. It's not new capacity. It's capacity that was already being built. We're just labeling it as our contribution. Third, there are political and regulatory hurdles. Environmental groups oppose new pipeline construction. Some Indigenous communities have concerns about projects crossing their territories. The regulatory approval process in Canada is notoriously slow and complicated. The Carney government has been trying to streamline approvals for nation-building projects. They've shaken up the assessment process. But changing the culture of Canadian energy regulation is a multi-year effort, not something that happens overnight. So yes, there are challenges, but here's why I'm optimistic about Canada's energy future. This crisis is a wake-up call. For decades, the world has relied on Middle Eastern oil and Russian gas because it was cheap and abundant. But now everyone is seeing the risks. Russian energy funded a war in Ukraine. Countries that depended on Russian gas got burned when Putin used it as a weapon. Europe scrambled to find alternatives and paid massive premiums for LNG shipments. And now, Middle Eastern energy can be cut off by a single conflict in the Gulf. One war, one closed strait, and suddenly 20% of global supply is gone. Canadian energy doesn't have those risks. We're a stable democracy, we have rule of law, we have long-term contracts that companies can actually rely on. We're not going to invade our neighbors or threaten to blow up shipping lanes. The world is learning that energy security matters. Cheap oil isn't worth much if it can be turned off at any moment by a dictator or a war. Canada represents something different. Reliability, stability, predictability. Those are qualities that energy importing countries will pay a premium for. And the numbers back this up. According to Statistics Canada, foreign direct investment into Canada is now the highest it's been in almost 20 years. Money is flowing into Canadian energy projects because investors see the opportunity. For years, people have talked about Canada becoming an energy superpower. We've had the resources, but we haven't had the infrastructure or the political will to fully develop them. This moment could change that. Prime Minister Carney's budget, 2025, included billions of dollars in spending to grow Canada's energy exports, logistics, and shipping sectors. The government is talking about new pipelines to the West Coast, new LNG facilities, expanded port capacity. The recent trade missions to India, Japan, and Australia are part of a coordinated strategy to lock in long-term customers for Canadian energy. These aren't just diplomatic photo ops. They're commercial negotiations worth billions of dollars. The Cameco uranium deal with India is worth $2.6 billion. That's real money flowing into Saskatchewan's economy. That's jobs for Canadian workers. That's tax revenue for Canadian governments. And there's more where that came from. India wants Canadian LNG. Japan wants Canadian LNG. South Korea wants Canadian LNG. European countries that got burned by Russian gas dependence are looking for alternatives. If Canada can build the infrastructure to deliver, the customers are there waiting. Now, some people will ask, what about climate change? Isn't this just doubling down on fossil fuels when we should be transitioning to clean energy? It's a fair question, and I want to address it directly. First, the reality is that the world still runs on oil and gas. Global demand for fossil fuels hasn't peaked yet. Developing countries in Asia and Africa need energy to lift their populations out of poverty, and right now, that means oil and gas. We can wish it were different, but that's the reality. Second, if someone is going to supply that oil and gas, wouldn't you rather it be Canada than Russia or Saudi Arabia? Canadian energy production has higher environmental standards than most other major producers. Our oil sands have been reducing emissions intensity for years. Our LNG is cleaner than coal, which is what many Asian countries would burn otherwise. Third, Carney has actually been pushing the low carbon angle for Canadian energy. He specifically highlighted Bay du Nord as producing very low carbon oil in terms of production and transportation. The argument is that if the world needs oil, it should be the cleanest oil possible. And Canadian offshore production fits that bill. Is this perfect? No, but it's pragmatic. And pragmatism might be what gets Canada through this moment of global uncertainty. Here's the bottom line. The world is in crisis. Energy prices are spiking. Countries that depend on Middle Eastern oil are scrambling for alternatives. And Canada has exactly what they need. We have the oil, we have the natural gas, we have the uranium, we have the critical minerals, and we have something that's even more valuable: stability. Countries are calling Canada right now, asking what we can sell them. That's not something that happens often. That's not something we should take for granted. Yes, we have challenges. Our infrastructure is constrained. Our regulatory process is slow. We can't flip a switch and suddenly flood the world with Canadian energy. But we can build, we can invest, we can expand capacity over time. And we can position Canada as the reliable, stable, trustworthy energy supplier that the world desperately needs. If we get this right, Canada won't just be a resource exporter. We'll be an energy superpower that our allies depend on. We'll have leverage in international negotiations. We'll have economic strength that protects us from the whims of American trade policy. And most importantly, we'll have prosperity for Canadian workers and families. Good jobs in the energy sector. Tax revenue for public services. A strong dollar backed by real resources. This is Canada's moment. The world is calling. Let's answer. If you want more content about Canada's role in the global economy, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're covering these stories every single day. I'll see you in the next one.